Hello, everyone, wherever you've joined from today, and thanks so much for joining and coming to FTL Partners webinar. We've got a really great lineup for today's session, covering how can distributed edge reduce cloud costs for enterprises, which we've kindly done in partnership with Varnish Software. So as you can see, we've got a jam-packed agenda today and a lot to get through in the next hour. So just to run you through this, we're going to be starting with a STL presentation from my colleague, Jack Hurley, who's going to be looking at the advantages of pursuing a distributed edge model for enterprises, particularly looking at the challenges and costs enterprises are facing with their IT architecture and how a distributed compute strategy can mitigate against this. This is then going to be followed by a presentation from Adrian Herrera, the CMO of Varnish Software, on how Varnish caching solutions can help enable improved performances for enterprises. We're then going to further explore the topics discussed in the presentation with a Q&A with questions asked from you, yourselves, the audience, and have a chance to get involved before we round out the day. But first, just to begin with, we're going to go through a few housekeeping points for our audience today on the next slide. So as you can all see, you should all have a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, which you can expand or hide using the orange button at the top, labeled as arrow 1. There's also a questions box in the control panel, so please type questions or comments throughout the webinar, and we'll go through these at the end in the Q&A discussion. And just to let you know, we'll only use your first name so people won't know who has asked what. Also, just to remind you that all attendees are muted and you are all in listen-only mode. And if you're facing any issues at all with any of the technical stuff, please notify us in the chat box. And then secondly, you can also raise your hand using the hand button to get our attention, which is arrow 2. And finally, if you have problems with sound, please try adjusting your volume settings locally, and if necessary, then sign out and sign back in again. And then the final point is just to mention that with the conclusion of the webinar, we'll then send a recording both of today's session and the slides round to you so you can share with your colleagues. But now, just before we formally begin, on the next slide, we're just going to introduce our panelists and speakers who you can all see today. From STL Partners, we have Jack Hurley, a consultant, who's going to be running through our presentation. We have myself, Henry Osborne, who's a senior consultant at STL, who'll be moderating the panel. And then finally on the STL side, we have Tilly Gilbert, one of our directors from the consulting team, who also heads up our edge computing practice here at STL Partners. And finally, we're very lucky to be joined by Adrian Herrera, the CMO and North American GM from Varnish Software. He previously headed marketing at Caringo, which was acquired by Datacore, establishing the company as a leader in the object storage space, and was also on the founding team and headed marketing at Navarnix. So Adrian's going to be presenting in a little bit, but first, let me hand over to my colleague, Jack Hurley, for his presentation.
Thanks, Henry. So STL recently conducted a survey with 200 enterprises across North America and Europe. And the aim of this was to quantify trends in enterprise cloud adoption across 4 industry verticals. We'll dive into the specific questions that we posed to respondents across the presentation, but broadly, it's important to note that we were asking them about their current IT architecture, the trends and costs that they're seeing within cloud adoption, and their interest and perception of distributed hybrid cloud infrastructure. We had a hypothesis going into this program that despite the huge waves in migration from on-premise infrastructure to the cloud and the movement towards this sort of cloud-first strategy, that enterprises still need to further explore the role and the limitations of cloud and understand the alternative deployment models that may be preferable in light of security, performance, or cost. And that they may want to explore something a little bit more varied and distributed than hyperscaler compute. CIOs at the organizations responsible for decisions on infrastructure might need to become a bit more cloud smart rather than cloud first. So we had an even distribution of respondents from the 4 industry verticals, which were financial services, retail, media and entertainment, and technology. And it's good to acknowledge that these industries are the early adopters of cloud. They would have been shifting to the cloud 5 to 10 years ago. And we chose these verticals because of this, that they'd be able to give good insights around our hypothesis. Individual respondents hailed from larger enterprises of varying sizes, and it's also important to note that we excluded SMEs from our respondents. And we typically were hearing from the decision maker in the assessment or the implementation of IT services within organizations. So I mentioned distributed hybrid compute or distributed infrastructure briefly during that introduction. And just to sort of set this presentation up, it's important to be aware that the world of IT infrastructure, the running of softwares and solutions, is becoming increasingly complex for enterprises. It used to be really straightforward for an organization CIO to say, we're moving everything to the cloud. However, that's no longer the case, and more enterprises are moving towards a model that is still cloud-centric. It offers flexibility, it offers scalability, but it's more distributed, and it focuses on workloads for the right reasons. And this can be termed distributed hybrid compute. And in this model, public cloud, it's still very much going to be part of an enterprise's strategy. Enterprises are moving to this software as a service, and systems such as HR, such as payments, they're all still going to be run in the public cloud. But what is interesting is we're also starting to see enterprises leverage private cloud and private data centers for storing data that's concerned with security, sovereignty, and compliance. And this could be around the use of AI and similar advanced technologies. So enterprises are going to be augmenting public cloud with private cloud, and they'll also be continuing to use some of their own infrastructure, either through co-location or on-premise. So whilst this has been declining as an operating model, a significant proportion of enterprises, they still have on-premises infrastructure, and that's not something that we see changing anytime soon. Enterprises, they're now using public, private, and enterprise-owned infrastructures with a distributed hybrid compute model. But the reality is, unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. One layer down from all of these high-level deployment options, there are many cached versions of stored data for each of the three infrastructures, workloads that are being pushed from the public cloud, from the private cloud, and the enterprise-owned infrastructures onto even more distributed caching technology. And this reduces the strain of the network with requests not being sent between two server locations, such as co-location or private data centers, and instead they're being sent to more proximate locations, which is helping make all of the different infrastructure locations cheaper, more scalable, and more performant. Those enterprises that are looking to delight the customers with differentiated experiences and solutions that load swiftly will be well aware of the need for cached workloads, and that's shown by more than 70% of today's internet traffic flows flowing through some form of distributed compute architecture and then being cached in global locations. But it's also important to note that enterprises, especially larger ones, should realize that distributed compute can have a significant impact on their internal workflows too. So, for instance, enterprises can ensure that artifacts and files that need to be accessed regularly by teams are cached, so that requests are dealt with in a more localized way. So, how should enterprises wishing to adopt this distributed hybrid compute solutions do so? Well, there are a number of considerations to ponder over before implementing this sort of IT environment, and we created 5 recommendations to best support this. So the first is to ensure organizational alignment within the enterprise, particularly between the IT and finance teams, when gathering and evaluating cloud costs in their entirety and assessing whether to have a more OPEX or CAPEX centric IT strategy. So, for example, where it may not seem attractive for enterprises to buy and operate personal servers, the overall investment may be lower than ongoing cloud OPEX costs. So enterprises should be carrying out a cost-benefit analysis to consider the impact of their revenues were they not to adopt a distributed architecture. Enterprises also have to be forward-thinking about requirements, considering their future IT requirements alongside their current needs. And the reality is that IT requirements, they'll grow in line with organizational expansion. Initially, this sort of rapidly expanding enterprises, rapidly growing enterprises, they might find that flexibility and scalability offered by the public cloud providers is more attractive. But as the expansion starts to stabilize, they might find that it's cheaper to run some of its workloads on an enterprise-owned infrastructure, which sort of supports this idea of the benefits of a flexible infrastructure that a distributed environment offers. And the final recommendation of these first 3 is that for enterprises to understand which workloads to actually distribute. So I mentioned earlier that more than 70% of today's internet traffic flows through some form of distributed compute architecture, and alongside content distribution, this is a well-known strategy for large internet companies to improve performances. And I'll just restate again that enterprises, they should also realize that distributed compute can have a significant impact on internal workloads too. Enterprises ought to prioritize partners who reduce complexity and reduce complexity by building a distributed compute solution in-house through intuitive dashboards and interfaces. Whilst buying off shelf can be convenient, it reduces the need for internal skill sets, it can also come with the challenges where solutions are not purpose-built for the set of use cases, for the set of applications, and the set of workloads within an organization. And finally, enterprises should look to experienced vendors for expertise, looking for those who are experienced in handling distributed compute and will guarantee that there's a clear observability of what workloads are running where and how they're performing. So it's really important to sort of bear these recommendations in mind as I run through some of the findings from our survey. So in this next section, we're going to be looking at what the challenges and what the costs are that enterprises are facing within their IT architecture. So it's good to sort of kick us off with the current state of play. So we asked enterprises what the IT architecture is that they're currently using. And well, it was interesting to see that over 60% of enterprises have actually adopted a mixed infrastructure model with a mixture of cloud and customer-owned infrastructure. 33% of respondents are using a multi-cloud vendor model and 31% a single cloud vendor model. But what's interesting is that we can clearly see that there's no one prevailing IT architecture that enterprises are tending toward. Responses are still relatively fragmented, and this fragmentation is likely because enterprises, they all have their own distinct needs and distinct requirements. We also asked survey participants what the main challenges with their current IT architecture. So each respondent was only allowed to pick one challenge, which gives us sort of a view of collectively what enterprises are seeing as most problematic. And the most common challenge that was highlighted was security concerns. And that's regarding IT environments becoming more complex with more sensitive and confidential data to the point where they're potentially vulnerable to breach and security threats. Interestingly, there was a bit of a variation between the companies that had different IT architectures. So for enterprises who run workloads in the cloud, 47% identified security as their main challenge, which was far and away from the 29% of enterprises that run workloads on-premise and identified security as the main challenge. The second challenge is scalability, with almost a quarter of respondents having their main concern over not being able to scale. And that comes about from this sort of complexity of individual enterprise systems and potential dependency on legacy technologies, resource constraints, as well as interoperability. And then thirdly comes arcane cost management. So just shy of a fifth of respondents highlighted this as their main challenge. And enterprises are increasingly dependent on vast volumes of data. So I think another question that we asked was how much data enterprises are using over an annual period. And it was really interesting to see that 75% of them are using over 500 terabytes. So this sort of cost that is associated with the collection and management of data is critical, obviously, for a business, but is clearly a concern for them as well. And finally, performance limitations. So we're at a point now where enterprises are requiring greater levels of performance, reliability, and security from their systems, which can be problematic, especially when coupled with these outdated legacy IT environments that I referred to in the scalability issue. What is clear sort of from these challenges as a whole is that overcoming them is vital to an enterprise using digital technology to unlock new avenues for growth, efficiency, and innovation. We know that demand for cloud services is continuing to grow as enterprises increasingly explore digital transformation practices. With cloud-based applications, they're playing a crucial role in facilitating remote work. And we tried to sort of build on this with this survey question, which asked what the primary trigger was in adoption of cloud technology. And it concluded that almost 30% of enterprises see technical advancements in the industry as their primary trigger. By technical advancements, we're referring to sort of improvements in the industry that could benefit from cloud technology. The second trigger to highlight is around the biggest challenge that I mentioned in the last slide. So where cloud providers are offering centralized management platforms and monitoring tools to provide enterprises with greater visibility into their security and sort of curb the data breaches. And another challenge was increasing costs. And again, it can sort of be turned on its head as a trigger in the adoption of cloud technology, whereby cloud infrastructure is permitting flexibility in the scaling of resources, depending on usage, optimizing utilization, and managing costs. So cloud providers are also typically offering a pay-as-you-go model, which is obviously more attractive to customers. Increasing costs is something that's cropped up both as a main challenge for enterprises and as a primary trigger for them in adopting cloud over the last couple of slides. So we're going to dive into this in a little bit more depth now. And the key sort of takeaway is that in the last 2 years, 90% of enterprises have experienced rising cloud costs, with 80% of these experiencing over a 10% increase in costs. And it's due to the factors that we've mentioned over the course of the last few minutes. Just to restate, enterprises are generating and collecting larger volumes of data than ever before. And that is resulting in increased resource consumption and ultimately higher cloud storage and transfer costs. What maybe we haven't touched upon yet and can expand upon a little bit here is the idea that cloud providers are incurring substantial costs associated with the building and the maintaining of infrastructures to support their networks. And this is deterring providers from lowering prices, as it essentially means that enterprises have to bear those costs. So furthermore, that the demand for cloud services is continuing to grow, with businesses relying more heavily on digital transformation, remote work, and cloud-based applications. And it's putting an upward pressure on prices. And it's clear to see that enterprises don't think that these costs are really going to go anywhere, as we asked the sort of follow-up question of how much we expect the cost will change over the next 3 years. And the results showed that 75% of enterprises predict that costs will increase 10% or more. So now it's time to hear from you, our audience. So we'd love to hear what you believe are the largest category of cloud costs for enterprises from the following options. So got data storage, support and maintenance, data transfers or cloud egress and cloud ingress, backup and disaster recovery, and finally compute. So just to sort of restate them, data storage, support and maintenance, data transfer, backup and disaster recovery, and compute. I'll give you just can see responses are coming in. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Just give about 10 more seconds just to try and gauge as much as feedback as we can. Cool. I think we're probably good to close the poll there. Perfect. So just to sort of comment on them a little bit, you can see that 33% of you believe that data transfer is the biggest cost, or sorry, the biggest category of cloud costs, and that's followed by then compute and data storage, which are closely shared, second and third. So how does this actually, let's see how you, the audience, stacked up against our survey respondents? What did our enterprises see as the largest category of cloud costs? Well, data storage was recognized as the largest category of cloud costs, so not quite aligned with your views. So 29% of enterprises selected this. And this is, again, the idea of growing volumes of data and growing storage capacity requirements. And I guess coupled with increasing regulation requirements. So, for example, General Data Protection Regulation, they're now mandating the retention and secure storage of data for longer time periods, which incurs a greater charge. And as enterprises are migrating a larger proportion of their infrastructure to the cloud, that is what sort of explains the second most common response around support and maintenance, which is what just over a quarter of our enterprises highlighted, which obviously wasn't quite as well reflected within your guys' responses. But this is because sort of enterprises are needing to invest in training and skill development programs to ensure that their IT teams and environments are equipped with the expertise to effectively manage and maintain cloud environments. The third largest cloud cost was actually what you recognized as the largest, and just over a fifth of the enterprises recognized data transfer. And just something, sort of a bit of commentary on that, it's not necessarily that hyperscalers, they're increasing their fees. They're actually reducing certain fees. It's sort of that cloud egress costs are rising again due to this increase in data volume generated by enterprises. And enterprises, they're consuming more of a hyperscaler service because of this requirement for data, and therefore paying the hyperscaler to look after more infrastructure on their behalf, whilst also adopting mixed infrastructure models, which are incurring greater costs for data transfer between varying environments. such as cross-cloud provider boundaries. If it's a case, it's more a case that enterprises need to be smarter on when to use the hyperscaler cloud and when not to, which would perhaps curb these costs a little bit. Finally, for what our enterprises saw, it was 17% selected backup and disaster recovery, with enterprises investing more in advanced backup solutions to protect against data loss and mitigate the impact of cyber attacks, the managing and backing up of disaster recovery across mixed infrastructure environments. It requires a lot of specialized tools, specialized expertise, and resources. So it's interesting to see how the results of your audience compared with the enterprises. What we'll now start to sort of discuss and explore is what the enterprises can actually do about these challenges. What are the enterprises doing about it? So just over 60% of our respondents have started to counter increased cloud costs by implementing cost optimization strategies. And we expect that this will only increase as the issue of increased cloud costs persists for the foreseeable future. We interestingly found that optimizing cloud costs becomes increasingly important as a company gets bigger. So as the scale of operation grows, larger enterprises, they're better positioned to manage infrastructure efficiently whilst having reduced financial constraints. And we also gathered some qualitative results by asking respondents to actually expand on some of the type of strategies that they're implementing to optimize cloud costs. So what was evident was that there's clearly no one solution to minimize these cloud costs, and responses were more unique and individual to their organization. So they're not going to be on the screen, but just to rattle off a couple, one respondent from the retail vertical highlighted that they're identifying mismanaged resources and using auto scaling to reduce costs, whilst another respondent from the financial services sub-vertical stated that they're negotiating deals with their cloud provider whilst looking to reduce their cloud storage. On the topic of solutions, we separately asked respondents to what their current level of interest in deploying a distributed hybrid cloud solution was. And the results were interesting. They indicated that over 95% of enterprises are looking towards a distributed hybrid compute solution to mitigate cloud costs, with nearly 40% actually having deployed a solution fully. So why is this such a viable solution for enterprises? Well, we shared results earlier in the presentation from our question on challenges that enterprises are experiencing within their IT architecture. Security, scalability, cost, performance were identified as the core 4 challenges. These directly map to the benefits identified as to why an enterprise would adopt a distributed hybrid compute solution. A distributed hybrid compute strategy increases data protection and navigates industry-specific legislation that varies from country to country, improving security and compliance, and whilst enabling enterprises to quickly adapt to changing demands without being constrained to the capacity of a single data center or a single provider. And that is where the boosted flexibility and scalability is offered. It also enables enterprises to allocate workloads to the most cost-effective infrastructure based on resource availability and budget aiding cost efficiencies. And finally, distributed hybrid compute facilitates organizations to place computing resources closer to the end users, improving performance. And all of this is sort of showing that pursuing a distributed hybrid compute strategy enables enterprises to mitigate the current challenges they're experiencing with their IT architecture, synergies with increased security, flexibility, cost efficiencies, and performance. Thank you very much. If you have any questions on my content, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to address them in the panel section. I'll now hand over to Adrian, who will be talking more in depth on caching. Adrian.
Thanks, Jack. So some very interesting results there. We'll just jump into how caching technology can be applied to optimize cloud costs and improve performance. So if we go to the next slide, I think the obvious question is, why is cache such a good technology to optimize distributed performance? And the short answer is because that's why it was developed in the first place. From a caching perspective. But here are some of the features and some of the functions and some of the techniques that are used by a lot of different caches out there in the market, not just Varnish, to optimize transfer. And you can see we start at the left hand with millions of requests. I'm looking at the graphic right now. And then it scales all the way down to single requests. But caching as an approach stores data or data that is used frequently in a faster part of memory, usually memory, but there are also disk-based caches. But there's also some tactics like request coalescing or collapsing similar requests into single requests, sharding, using hashing to also collapse similar requests. So when you combine all of these different approaches, you can start to collapse the number of requests significantly, which improves access to those requests significantly, and it protects the origin. Now, I should say you see the different tiers, the edge tier, the storage tier, the origin shield tier. All of these can either sit on-prem, they could sit in the cloud. So it was interesting to see the results of the surveys where organizations are taking a variety of strategies from a cloud perspective, but regardless of the strategy, whether everything's in cloud, maybe you're using a VPC or virtual private network in a cloud or virtual private cloud. Maybe you're using a combination of public cloud and your own network in a colo facility. Maybe you're using infrastructure as a service. Maybe you're a telco and you're providing services to other organizations. Regardless of the approach, you can use caching technology to optimize any HTTP or HTTPS transfer between those different sites, between those different origins. In this case, origin could be AWS, it could be GCP, it could be OCI, it could be a web server, it could be an application server. So anything over HTTP or HTTPS, if you have a lot of concurrent transactions, if you're trying to handle a lot of load, if you have a lot of access to similar data, like unstructured data, then cache is a very, very good candidate to come in and help optimize that. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see that best of breed caching solutions take it one step further, really focusing on security, focusing on probing, and this is where the benefit of cache really comes into play. So you can see there all the way, we'll start at the right this time and go left. But if there is some form of disruption and the application can't connect to the origin, in some instances, in a lot of instances, if the content that the user is trying to reach is cached, then even if the origin is down, it can still be delivered. That content can still be delivered. That process can still happen. And you can see cache can also be used to improve resilience. So if there are failed requests, you can try over. And again, this is just scratching the surface of what cache can do. One of the benefits of Varnish is to be able to really customize specific logic and run it at the edge. We have our own language that's used by a number of different content delivery networks out there called VCL, Varnish Configuration Language. But when you compare or when you combine the different tactics I just went over, the different approaches, along with the ability to customize and run logic at the edge, you get a very, very powerful solution which can significantly optimize costs, significantly reduce API calls, significantly reduce ingress and egress fees, and it can also be used to improve performance. So a lot of times, organizations may not even know they're using cloud platforms. They sign up for a specific solution, let's say a development tool, an Atlassian JFrog, Sonatype, and a lot of those platforms are running in AWS along with some of the other hyperscaler platforms. So even if you're not struggling with those with very direct hyperscaler costs, if you're using applications or any sort of software as a service, a lot of times cache can come in and help optimize the transfer, reduce costs, and more importantly, improve performance so that it improves the actual productivity you get for those tools, or from those tools, I should say. So if we go to the next slide, we'll actually look at an example without Varnish. And you see on the left side there, the clients, HTTP, HTTPS. On the right side, you see the web application server and then the database. This is a very, very simplified view of a web application workload. But why I wanted to show you the impact of cache. You see it's 40 milliseconds time to first byte. each page view is being generated. There's calls to the database. Now, if we go to the next slide, we actually see the benefit of applying cache to this workload. It went from 40 milliseconds to under 1 millisecond time to first byte. The content was served directly from memory, but you can also add disk-based caching to add that persistence and more resilience to the overall workflow. So again, it's showing a significant reduction in latency, and that also results in a reduction in the number of API calls and the number and the amount of data transferred overall to the application, and in this case to the cloud, or the other way around, to the client, wherever that client is sitting. So again, just showing the impact of cache. And if we go to the next slide, you actually show these are real world graphs and real world snapshots and benchmarks of performance improvements that were achieved with Varnish. Again, we've been doing this for a very, very long time, and we have demonstrated the value for a number of different customers. You can see the significant drop in overall latency and time to first byte. You can see the value that cache brings to these particular environments. And if we go to the next slide, we translate that into business value, or our customers, or actually we'll go over solutions and use cases first, and then we'll go over the values and benefits from an overall numbers perspective. But here is how cache is being used today. For content delivery, I think this is where most people's minds go because it's very easy to understand. Private and public content delivery over the internet, private content delivery that doesn't necessarily need to hit the public internet. But I do want to call your attention to that center section there, web and API acceleration. So cache can be used for front-end websites, a gateway for API services, and a gateway for microservice architectures. That's really where cache was originally needed and grew as a popular architecture approach from a web application perspective. So although many people, when we talk about cache, they go to that initial content delivery use case, cache was really developed and increased in popularity because of web and API acceleration. And arguably, web and API acceleration is a subset, a sub-use case under content delivery. And if we go to the next slide, we start to look at actual value delivered by implementing cache. So again, across the board, these are real world values that were communicated to Varnish or by our customers after implementing cache. Again, I won't read all of these, but I'll just point a few out that are very relevant here. So you see 15x in the middle. That was one of our customers, Nowcom, 15 times lower cloud costs by implementing a caching solution. You see that there's 80% lower latency by Zype. You see 12 times lower server load by ETH. And again, there's a number of different benefits implementing cache, but you can see a trend here of improving availability, increasing resilience to be able to stay up during outages, reducing latency, improving load times, and reducing costs. And one that we're really seeing trending recently is that lower right-hand corner, improving developer productivity. We're seeing that as a very large value that is being that cache can deliver to organizations. So if we go to the next slide, just an example of some of the brands that we're helping. We can't mention all the brands that we're helping today, but these are the brands that have implemented Varnish technology. 50% of the top global streaming providers, over 25 global telcos, and we're helping a lot of the most major brands improve performance, reduce their cloud costs, and really improve their hybrid cloud approaches. And I think that's it. We'll shift into the Q&A section. Right, Jack and Tilly?
Right. Perfect. Well, thanks so much both for your presentations Jack and Adrian. They were both really interesting and insightful, and hopefully given our audience a lot to think about as we now move on to the Q&A section of the webinar. So just a reminder to the audience, please continue to submit your questions using the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screen. We started to have a couple come in, but do keep those questions coming to make sure you can ask Adrian and Tilly any questions that you may have. But just to kick things off, first I'll just turn to you, Tilly, and bring you into the mix. I think there's a slight variance in what Jack mentioned earlier, is what we saw in our enterprise survey. I think it was data storage was seen as the biggest category of cloud costs for enterprises, but then from the audience today, they sort of voted for data transfer and cloud ingress as that biggest category. I guess, what do you think accounts for that difference, or is it just that different types of enterprises are seeing different types of cloud costs? But yeah, I'd want to invite Tilly to comment on that first and foremost.
Yeah, happy to. And Adrian, you might have your own thoughts on that poll as well that you might want to add. My sense is a couple of things I would say. One is we were asking our enterprises, forcing our enterprises to select the single biggest cost bucket that they were experiencing. In reality, lots of what we know and we hear from enterprises, first of all, is that their bill from cloud providers can be very complex. It can be difficult to understand, and some of them deal with bill shock, where they don't necessarily know month on month exactly what they're going to be getting from their vendors. And we also know that a typical enterprise bill is certainly going to consist of a number of different line items. In fact, all of the line items that we broke out on the poll. I think the thing that's maybe notable is that you might expect compute to be the single biggest line item in an enterprise bill, because that's where you probably associate the most value from from cloud solutions, is actually from when it is crunching the data or providing some sort of outcome or insight for an enterprise. And what we saw is, yes, that is a significant cost, but it's not always the biggest one. And enterprises are having to handle things like significant requirements about the length of time that they have to store different data, which will only increase as they look to do more and more data crunching and implement AI technologies and so on and so forth, that will need data to be available and need it to be stored and retained for quite some time. And I think it's understandable that our audience picked out on the egress fees, because we are certainly hearing a lot about that in the industry at the moment. And it might not be the single biggest line item on an enterprise bill, but it's certainly a line item which enterprises don't want to have to see significant amounts of, and one where perhaps they feel a little bit hard done by, that they are being penalized for taking information or data out of the cloud, in comparison to something like compute and storage, where there's a genuine benefit and service to being offered. So I think enterprises are perhaps a little bit more open to the fact that that's something that they're going to need to be charged for. So yeah, I think there's a few complexities behind that poll and behind the question that we were trying to tease out with enterprises that probably been reflected in the way that the audience responded. But Adrian, does that sort of chime with what you're seeing? Were you surprised by that poll and how things went down?
Yeah, actually, the polls are, I think, more in line with what we're seeing from an overall cost perspective. And I think and it really depends on who has visibility into the bill and what part of the bill they have visibility into. The hyperscalers and clouds are so massive, and a lot of organizations have so many different processes, so many different business units, so many different people involved in managing the cloud, maintaining, growing, and optimizing the cloud, that it really depends on who you're talking to. Overall, I think what most people don't realize is, even though some cloud platforms say that they don't charge you for ingress and say they don't really charge you for certain types of egress, when you really take a look at what's happening, if you're moving from one region to another, if you're using some other aspect of the service that may not be included in that, you really need to read the terms and conditions. Then you see those ingress and egress fees start to rise considerably, And I will say there's an element of timeliness here. What is the highest priority issue for that particular month, and that may change month over month. So as we exited the year, the beginning of the year, there may have been certain challenges and issues like security. Whereas we get into we're halfway through, almost done with Q2. Then the thoughts may have shifted to, okay, now we need to control the costs. We set up security. Now we do need to start controlling costs because we need to start working on 2025 budgets. And that's that's also a little bit of what's happening. I think that'd be my take.
Yeah, so cloud costs very much variating and fluctuating, and depends on what the priorities are for the enterprise at that particular time. Yeah, thanks. That's great to get your insights, both Adrian and Tilly, onto the poll. We start to have some questions now come in from the audience, so do keep on bringing those up. So we've got a question here for Adrian. So for massive low latency live streaming content where milliseconds really matter, do you see any difference in terms of delay between a public cloud, private cloud, or bare metal installation? That one's for you, Adrian.
Yeah. I think the short answer is yes. That when you're trying to really focus on low latency, you're going to want to take a single tenant approach, whatever that approach is, and you do want to have bare metal installation. I mean, every IT administrator, professional out there will say you always want fully dedicated resources that'll give you the most control over latency and over optimization. But even in a virtual world, you can have a virtual private cloud or virtual private network, and really still control that latency. When you're dealing with a lot of tenants, there's no way for you to control those other tenants. So if someone decides to run some sort of workload or has some sort of spike in their application, it can really draw resources from that multi-tenant approach. So that's the only one I would say, okay, you really need to have a certain degree of confidence that your content delivery network or your IT teams can guarantee specific performance for a period of time, for that period of time that you need it during that live event. But if you are looking at live events, then you should look at some sort of, the first recommendation would be, private bare metal deployment, some sort of load balancing, to the major network providers out there, or telcos, depending on where you are in the world. And if you can't do that, then take a look at some virtual private approach. And then of course you do have the public internet, and then the public CDNs. They are very, very good at this, but even they would be doing that management for you if you had this type of event. So they would have their teams at the ready. They'd be the ones being able to make sure that you have that performance that you need when you need it.
Perfect. Well, thanks for your insight into that, Adrian. Hopefully that has answered the question for the audience member. I think what we'll do now is we'll turn to our second poll, just to keep the audience on their toes and make sure they're involved throughout the Q&A. So if we just go on to the next slide, the question will pop up. So now we're going to ask audience, what do you see as the primary benefits in adopting a distributed hybrid compute solution? So again, there are 5 options. So for option 1, please select security and compliance. For option 2, select flexibility and scalability. If you think it's really around cost efficiencies, then option 3, performance improvement for option 4, and then finally resource optimization for option 5. So yeah, starting to see the responses come in now. So just give you a few more seconds just to make sure we get enough of the audience. So just to run through: option 1, security and compliance; option 2, flexibility and scalability; option 3, cost efficiencies; option 4, performance improvement; and then option 5, resource optimization. So yeah, just give you a last couple of seconds, and then we will close the poll and show the results on screen for both Tilly and Adrian to comment on for you. So yeah, happy to close the poll now. Perfect. So yeah, you should now see the results on the screen pop up. So as you can see here, it's flexibility and scalability with 36%, and then performance improvement at 24% as the 2 primary triggers. So yeah, right to the Adrian. I don't know if either you particularly want to jump in there first and start commenting on this. But yes, those are the two leading options. I think in the poll that we did, flexibility and scalability was one of the top options in our enterprise survey, alongside security compliance. So a slight switch here with performance improvement, switching out for security compliance. But flexibility and scalability was again both seen within our enterprise survey and then within our poll here. But yeah, I'll turn to Tilly or Adrian if either of you want to jump in first.
Well, I think from my perspective, the security and compliance question, I can understand some of the hesitation around identifying that as a definitive primary benefit, just because there is a huge amount of complexity when it comes to, to data sovereignty, data security, and compliance. And yes, one element of that might potentially be about where you physically store that data and what sort of infrastructure it's on and what sort of permissioning and access you enable for that data. But there's a whole lot of complexity beyond that, and in some ways distributing workloads across different locations can add some more complexity. So I can understand why the audience might feel reticent to immediately jump in and say that that is a definitive benefit. I think in some instances, for some types of organizations, it will be, and for others, there may be a an element of complexity that comes with not just, for instance, storing all data with one primary cloud provider who has a set of compliance that they have to withhold on your behalf. So that would be my sort of immediate comment on that one. And then obviously Jack explored quite a lot around the cost efficiencies question, which is, I think, it perhaps is easy when you're in the technology or the sort of networking world to think that enterprises care deeply about that sort of infrastructure and want to invest in class, and that is true. But there are plenty of enterprises that are also really focused on their primary goal of delivering for their customers and delivering for their employees, and they want this side of things. They see this side of things as more of an enabler than a core part of their DNA. And for them, I think there is an element of wanting to look for something which is as cost efficient as possible. So yeah, those would be my two comments. But Adrian, I bought you some time to think through something very eloquent to say as well.
Well, thank you for that, Tilly. Thank you. And it's interesting. Security and compliance is the one option there that can be seen as a benefit, or it could be seen as a very specific use case. And I think as a benefit, as a general benefit, flexibility does get you the ability to provide different types of secure deployments or secure access to data. I think anyone who's had to deal with compliance, you start to go into a different world. The addition of compliance basically means, okay, you're starting to really define specific controls and processes that you need to start to validate and check over time. And so I think that number two, flexibility and scalability is the right way to approach this from an overall IT or service provider perspective. You're providing the underlying infrastructure and the underlying approaches that can really enable these flexible approaches. So in the object storage world, we would always say, for these different compliance and regulations, that the object store itself isn't HIPAA compliant, but it enables HIPAA compliance, right? Because it really is up to the organizations to be able to satisfy the different regulations and regional requirements that they have from a security and compliance perspective. So, even though security isn't there, a lot of organizations will need to deal with that. And I do think that flexibility and scalability, help you check that number one off, and then you can work on the other characteristics. So that's kind of the way I would approach it. But again, a lot of it depends on who's responding and what their role is and what kind of visibility they have in the organization.
And Adrian, one thing would be like the observability. I get the sense that one of the first things that you have to get right for security and compliance is just have that clear observability, clear dashboard and understanding of what's going on where, of where your traffic's going, of where things are being stored. Is that something that you have more experience probably with enterprises on the ground doing this? Would you echo that? Is that something that you guys see with Varnish and what enterprises are trying to do in terms of that as being almost a stepping stone on the way to then being able to to kind of ensure that you're kind of looking after your data in the best way?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and also access patterns and what is being seen. And Varnish has very, very detailed and robust logs for a particular reason. It's you really need to see how your data is being used. You really need to see how it's being accessed, how the underlying processes are performing, and that could be seen in a number of different ways. It could be seen in dashboards, a lot of open source tools out there. But it is not just about the data itself, but how it's accessed. A lot of the times with these security and compliance approaches, the application of the platform should not have visibility into the data itself. It's all about really making sure that the data hasn't been tampered with, that the data hasn't been accessed by anyone it shouldn't be accessed by. And if there is some sort of abnormal or abnormality in the way that it's being accessed, that connection can be terminated, and overall the data in the application can be secured. So that is one of the primary functions and benefits of a caching solution that isn't often talked about. But when you do have a lot of these transactions, a lot of concurrent requests, it's very, very similar to a DDoS attack or some other malicious attack. So, caching technologies can be used. And of course, I know I kind of went a little bit techie there, but yeah, from a security and compliance perspective, you do want to have as much captured and logged as possible so that you can go take a look at, those logs.
Perfect. Well, no, thanks, Adrian, Tilly, both your perspectives, and Tilly for jumping in first to answer that question based off the poll. But always great to get your insights live and reflect on the what the audience thought, and then I guess you as our experts as well. But we'll have a few more questions coming in. So just remind everyone there's last few minutes left of the Q&A, so do get those final few questions coming in. And any questions we don't cover in today's session, we will cover in the Q&A document that we'll send over to you. So no worries if they're not answered. We've got another question for you, Tilly. So this audience member is asking, is compute not a primary requirement for enterprises because many companies are already in evolutionary stages of AI transformation? It'd be great to get your comments and thoughts on that one.
I mean, I think that's right. I think it is. There are very few organizations that are focused on an entirely storage-centric strategy. Most use cases are going to have a mixture of compute and storage that are required, and it's really going to depend on the specifics of the use case to exactly what that mix looks like. I think AI, obviously there is a lot of discussion right now among enterprises and the CIO and CTO teams wanting to understand how AI might impact their business over the next couple of years. I think that will have an impact on compute for sure, but it will also have an impact, I think, on storage because, like we were talking about, there will be a significant increase in requirements for data lakes and for being able to provide that log and observability for some time as to what data has been stored and how it's been used. So I think it will be both, but I also think that AI is going to add an additional wave of complexity around that picture that Jack was describing of figuring out what workloads should run where to really optimize the performance and the cost for an enterprise. And we're likely to see that continued trend of particularly, I think, larger enterprises, particularly probably enterprises which have gone through that scaling up process and perhaps have a little bit more understanding and expectation about what workloads they have and where they should run, who might need to start to take back a little bit more control in terms of kind of deciding how they should architect their IT and where they should be placing workloads. So yeah, it's clearly a big topic right now. I think it's going to shape things in a few different ways.
Perfect. Thanks, Tilly. Great to get your insights. Yeah. And just, Adrian, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, from the caching perspective, if the transfer is happening over HTTP or HTTPS, it could be optimized, regardless of the application. And that is one thing to point out for a lot of these AI workloads in distributed environments, regardless of where they are. A lot of the times you see that there's a cache in there. That's why we use the term gateway or reverse proxy, because all it's doing is it's optimizing the transfer of the data that's already there. It's not really manipulating the data in any way. It's just optimizing the transfer of that data in the most efficient way. So even in these new workloads, as long as it's happening over HTTP or HTTPS, cache could be used to optimize the transfer, to improve performance, to reduce the overall load wherever that data is going. And that's going to become very important for AI use cases as they become more distributed, as we start to hear about AI sovereignty, right? I think NVIDIA is starting to push that one. You need to control your data. You need to keep it within your region. We're going to see that it really start to increase in importance. But just to understand for all the service providers out there, for the organizations listening, that as long as it's happening over HTTP or HTTPS, you can use cache to optimize the transfer performance and overall load on wherever the actual end compute is happening.
Perfect. Thanks, Adrian. Great to get your opinion on that and thoughts on that. So we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions, depending on how much time Adrian and Tilly take on their answers. But just another question for you that's come in, Adrian. Are there any particular customer success stories that have had demonstrated significant cost reductions achieved by Varnish caching solutions at all? And any sort of particular case studies that have come out? So yeah, any audience members keen to know?
Yeah, I think overall it was some of those that were listed on the benefits by the numbers slide. The overall 15 times reduction in cloud costs and overall improvement in latency. I would just encourage people to go take a look at the use case section on the Varnish website. It's the benefits are so varied that I think people really need to look at similar customers and similar approaches within their particular use case and industry to really see what the benefits are. But I mean, we've had a number of them. Like even though the backend origin is down, the application is still 100% available. Optimization and of server load, reducing 12 servers all the way down to 1 server. So there are a lot of benefits in implementing caching technology, but it needs to be implemented in the correct way. And that is one thing, that there are a lot of caching solutions out there. There are a lot of general purpose caches that are part of platforms. But if you're not seeing the results, if you're using those today, you're not seeing the results that you're looking for, I would encourage people to reach out to an organization like Varnish, an organization that specializes specifically in cache.
Perfect, thanks, Adrian. And we'll send out the slides to everyone so they have all those stats, and they have a link to the Varnish website so they can go on and take a look. I guess we just got a couple of minutes, so maybe one final question for you, Tilly. So someone asks, what are the main challenges that you see with pursuing a distributed compute infrastructure, and I guess how can an enterprise potentially mitigate against these? So I know I've only given you a minute, but if you could quickly give an answer to that one.
I mean, I think that we are hearing significant challenges from enterprises just around how they get the right team, basically internally, to handle quite a complex environment that Jack sketched out with a few different decision makings. A lot of enterprises these days would like a team which is really quite software centric, and that's where their skill sets and their sort of background and history are. And being able to also make sure that you have individuals there that can understand the networking and the infrastructure side of things can be hard to find and and hard to retain and sort of incentivize. So for us, that's what we've heard, and obviously that's where enterprises may want to think about working with partners who can help to support them and make things simple for those that perhaps haven't sort of been born and raised in that world of more of the networking and the infrastructure side of things.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Adrian. I know we're at time, so it was great to get both your insights in this panel, and we'll follow up with everyone for any of the questions that aren't and weren't covered today. So just a reminder that all registrants will receive both a link to this recording, but they'll also get the slides as well that they can share around with their team, and the Q&A write-up should come in the next week. But if you have any questions at all, please contact either myself or Jack, and we can pass on any questions you have to Adrian and the Varnish team as well. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining today, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day and your week.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.